right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rumi Forum. Very pleased to have with us today Mr. Daniel Brumberg, and he will be speaking on conflict, identity, and reform in the Muslim world. It is actually the title of his book, Challenges for U.S. Engagement. Mr. Brumberg is an acting director of USIP's Muslim World Initiative in the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, where he focuses on issues of democratization and political reform in the Middle East and wider Islamic world. He is also an associate professor at Georgetown University and a former senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment's Democracy and Rule of Law project. Previously, he was a Jennings Randolph senior fellow at USIP, where he pursued a study of power sharing in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Mr. Brumberg was a Mellon Junior Fellow at Georgetown University and a visiting fellow at the International Forum on Democratic Studies. He was a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at Emory University and a visiting fellow in the Middle East program in the Jimmy Carter Center, and has taught at the University of Chicago. Mr. Brumberg is the author of many articles on political and social change in the Middle East and wider Islamic world. With a grant from the MacArthur Foundation, he is currently working on a comparative study of power-sharing experiments in Algeria, Kuwait, and Indonesia, a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy and the advisory board of the International Forum on Democratic Studies. Mr. Brumberg is also chairman of the nonprofit Foundation on Democratization and Political Change in the Middle East. He has worked closely with a number of non-governmental organizations in the Arab world, including the Palestinian Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs. Brumberg is also a member of the editorial board of the American Political Science Association's Political Science and Politics. He received his BA from Indiana University and a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Brumberg. And I'll just let you go ahead and
well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today, and in a town where there's many things going on, it's gratifying to have a good turnout. This book is an unusual book that we're talking about today. It's, on one level, it's a reader. It's a collection of essays by staff from USIP, but also from our grantees. It's meant to reflect and provide a kind of comprehensive overview of the work that the United States Institute of Peace has been doing in the Middle East and broader Muslim world, with a focus on issues of conflict resolution, dialogue, and political change. Now, when you take an institution that is as big and as complicated and complex as USIP, and you try to provide a publication that encapsulates its work, it's quite a challenge. And when we put the book together, we decided we couldn't possibly provide a coherent book that was conceptually coherent and that would not be 2,000 pages and one which you should be able to take on the airplane and read without breaking your arm. So we decided to focus on the work that USIP has been doing, both in terms of analytical work and its activist work, if you like, in terms of trying to provide programs and research on efforts at resolving identity conflicts in Muslim-majority states and societies. And as we say in the introduction, the extensive introduction of the book, which is co-edited by Dina Shahata. Dina is a scholar at the Al-Haram Center at Cairo University presently. As we said in the extensive introduction, our goal here is to recognize that in many respects we have seen in Muslim-majority countries a proliferation of sectarian, ideological, social, and political conflicts that have increasingly divided these societies. When we think of the Arab world, the part of the Middle East I know best, we often think about Lebanon as the example par excellence of this problem. But as we argue in this book, the problem of the divided society, of these sorts of identity conflicts, it can be found in countries that we often think about as culturally homogeneous or religiously homogeneous, such as Egypt, for example. These conflicts are not limited, but they certainly include conflicts between Islamists and secularists. But as we were talking about earlier today with your colleagues from the Rumi Forum, they really are conflicts that transcend the usual sort of Islamist secular divide. I like analytically to speak more about conflicts between Islamists and non-Islamists, because you can have very serious divisions about the role of mosque and state that separate very pious people from other very pious people, but this is more of an ideological divide. And so we try to recognize in the book the multiplicity of divides, and I think we also try to recognize that these divides have multiple sources. Part of them could be described as cultural and ideological, but an important part of the book is the way in which these conflicts have been manipulated, magnified, and used by autocratic regimes to sustain autocracy. And so sort of the analytical and conceptual problem, as well as the, if you like, the political challenge that we discuss in this book, through a multiplicity of examples, Yemen, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Indonesia, Somalia, is how and in what ways groups that whose conflicts may have an objective basis to them can overcome this effort of the state, particularly autocrats, to manipulate these conflicts by essentially coming together and finding ways to move beyond them. And so the issue of conflict resolution is not one that can be understood purely as a cultural problem or purely as a kind of instrumental political problem, but there's a link between the two. And beyond that, and the other dimension of this book, which really makes it unique, I think, and useful and still timely, is that the United States of America and our government has been involved in these conflicts in different ways as well, and involved in contradictory ways. And I think you can see this going back to our involvement in the Balkans, but you can see it manifest clearly in places such as Lebanon or certainly Iraq, and now much more so Afghanistan. And that is to say that we have been involved in essentially politically and militarily being involved, intervening in these countries, often manipulating these identity conflicts for our own purposes, paying a high price for it. Afghanistan is a good example of that. And at the same time, trying to sort of serve as a kind of arbiter that can create a context in which these groups can find a kind of common ground. So the Iraq example is an obvious one, and we intervene, we topple the regime, we essentially back the Shiites, and in so doing, we of course created a kind of security dilemma, let's call it that, for other groups, particularly the Sunni minority, who of course always insisted they were the majority, which they were not. But in any case, they felt legitimately cut out of the sort of arrangement, and that fed the whole insurgency. And so we had to back away from a kind of role as a partisan in the conflict to one in which we wanted to play a different kind of role, as one providing a kind of umbrella for security by which all these groups could feel that some movement towards democratic participation would not be also a movement towards the exclusion of one particular group, because democracy always carries with it the possibility that the ballot can be used to exclude certain kinds of groups. So that is a problem that this book looks at in some length, and that is how does the U.S. balance these contradictory roles, and what is the strategy by which we can move from being a partisan in conflicts essentially to a more neutral player. We see this in Afghanistan today in our relationship with the president, the just re-elected president, somebody who we brought in there. I mean, Karzai was in some sense crowned, let's be honest, by the United States. He was brought in there. And initially he had tremendous popularity. Well, much of that is washed away. And we found ourselves saddled with a leader whose credibility is on the line domestically because of for many reasons, one of which is corruption. We were trying to sort of find ways to encourage somebody who was in some sense a client to act differently and to address issues, one of which is the issue of corruption. So that is an issue that is very much represented in this book. And a third issue, and I'm going to stop there because I really want this to be a discussion, but a third issue that is very much represented, particularly in the first part of the book, it's divided into three parts, is the question of how to sort of address and resolve the kinds of conflicts we've been talking about this afternoon. And by way of framing this question or this debate, the beginning of the book sets up a kind of set of perhaps somewhat unnecessarily in terms of the ultimate complexities of realities, but of the complexity of the reality, but for purposes of analysis, we set up a kind of dichotomy between what might be seen as a kind of intellectual and psychological approach to conflict resolution built around the reinterpretation of Islamic texts, Islamic liberalism, conflict resolution strategies that are mostly built around psychological strategies of dialogue on the one hand, and more political and institutional strategies built around creating new institutional devices and incentives for conflict resolution. So we have an essay by my colleague and friend Abdul Salam Maghrawi, a Moroccan-American scholar, who focuses on this whole issue of ijtihad, interpretation, and so on. And then there's an essay by yours truly about the institutional dynamics, in which I argue that in the title of the essay and throughout the essay, that Islam is not the heart of the problem or really the solution, that what we face is a political context in which Islam has been instrumentalized. And so those two sort of debates are set up in the beginning, and that debate is followed throughout the whole book, because what we look at is institutional solutions, and we look at sort of more psychological, symbolic, and interpretive solutions, and we go back and forth, because ultimately these solutions work together. They are not mutually exclusive. You need to have the dialogue. You need to have my colleague David Smock, who you certainly know, has been involved in advancing a forum, and we're talking in these sort of dialogues. The dynamic is basically kind of symbolic. It's psychological. It's trying to create a degree of trust that will then sort of resonate. You need these sorts of processes. You need the sort of long-term effort to reinterpret sort of Islamic traditions, represented by many scholars, one of whom is at Georgetown University, Abdullahi An-Naim, a good friend of mine. I respect these traditions, and I respect the need for these kinds of activities, but I also feel very strongly that we need a political context of rules and constitutions that create an incentive along that. And so the book, that's a kind of third theme of the book, and so it's an ambitious book, but I think we do a pretty good job. I said when we produced the book, we have a 45-page introduction, because we felt that we needed to provide a framework to take the reader through the entire book. Maybe the reader wouldn't read everything in the book itself, but by sort of doing our job as tour guides of the rest of the readings, we would provide a kind of conceptually rich and sophisticated statement of the themes, so that the book will be really useful both for students and academics and policymakers. So that's it.
Quite an undertaking.
It was. It's about 2.5, 3 years in the making.
But very necessary. And the practical.
Ermal Hitay, graduate student economics, unfortunately, at the University of Maryland. Well, it's not political science or anything related. Plus, there's a lot of guilt to go around for us economists to appropriate in the last couple of years due to the crisis. However, picking up from your talk about the instrumentalization of Islam and about liberal interpretations of Islam and whatnot, so I tend to subscribe to the fact that when looking at the emergence of political Islam, the interpretation of the texts from the 7th, 8th century and whatnot is equally responsible with the perception of what was the best global practice at the time, which was the existence of a strong nation state. Right, so one would say that the top-to-bottom approach that political Islam endorsed was, in a sense, a product of the prevailing institutions, starting with the French Revolution. So, in that sense, how helpful would you think, or is there any encouragement of civil society Islam, or is there a place for encouragement of civil society Islam and bottom to top change, rather than the top to bottom approach, which sees the government as something to be captured and then used to cause social change? Thank you.
That's deserving of a 2-day conference. Maybe we should raise some funds and have it. You know, it's a really interesting way you've put it. And there's a book about civil Islam in Indonesia, which almost takes your title. It's very interesting because the Islamist or Islamic movements, because many of them would deny that they're Islamist, really were civil society movements that were started in the 20s and before and have millions of members. But I think that the modern-day Islamists, even more sort of moderate members of Islamic parties, of the PJD in Morocco or Islah in Yemen, and maybe even so, the same could be said in Turkey by the AK party, have a kind of ambivalent attitude towards the state. Because the state is seen often, and you're right, the French state, we often think about Islamism as a kind of medieval, but the models are very modern, and there's a lot of emphasis on fusing kind of religion as a political device with the state. But there has always been in contemporary Islamist sort of doctrine the notion that the state is only legitimate to the extent that it reflects the authentic culture of the populace. And that's the job of the state, to do that. And states which do that, which fulfill that function, are legitimate. And states that do not do that are not legitimate. And so there's an ambivalence towards the state. It's seen as an instrument for protecting a collective identity. And of course, if you look at the work of Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, he always said that in the context in which the state failed to do that, maybe the first thing to do was to create Islamic social system, Nizam Islami, on the ground. The purpose of which, of course, was to eventually capture the state, and not necessarily represent the idea that the best place for religion to thrive is not in the state itself, but on the social level. And the job of the state is to protect the freedom of people to practice their religion, which is a kind of an American approach to promoting religion rather than undermining it. In the U.S., as you know, the division of state, the purpose of distancing state and church is in some sense to enhance the integrity of religion, not to undermine it. So I think that the contemporary Islamist sort of doctrine has viewed, isn't antithetical to the notion of a kind of social, civil Islam, but sees it in highly instrumental terms, and not as an end, but it's still a means. And that is an approach that's very much indicative of the Arab world. I wouldn't want to, I was alluding to Indonesia, where there's a very different approach. I think you could say something that is similar also in Turkey as well. I think particularly where an issue that's not unimportant to the Rumi Foundation, I think that this notion of this sort of politicized Islam that you find in the Arab world is in part a reflection of the success of the state in removing various kind of Islamic cultural alternatives, including Sufism. Not removing it, but to reducing it to a kind of popular movement that has no political implications for the society. That was not the case in Indonesia, for example. You couldn't understand the movement Nahdlatul Ulama, the NU, without recognizing the extent to which a kind of indigenous Sufism became part of the social movement on the ground and became part of a kind of a political movement. The Arab world, in some sense, has rationalized Islam to the point where those sorts of diversities, which create the foundations for political negotiation and compromise, because diversities can work to fragment, but they also can create incentives for cooperation. So your question is well put, but I still don't see a kind of project which says, even again, I say this to my colleagues who are involved in Muslim Brethren in Egypt, I'm still looking for a project that says, well, we're not ultimately after seizing the state. We have a different project.
My name is Zakir Muhammad Jauhar, and I'm visiting from Pakistan. To me, actually, the problem regarding the Muslim identity comes from, initiates from, the colonial part. Because in most of the, take for example, the example of subcontinent, the greatest 20th century Muslim thinker, philosopher, poet, Iqbal, he had always been of the view that if you separate the church from the state, the religion from the state, so then it leads to being Genghis Khan and nothing else. So that was his basic premise and on that the state of Pakistan was created. So when the religion during the British times and other colonial powers was divorced from state, and mostly the secular people took over the state, so that is where the conflict started. Even take the example of Pakistan again, if the Islamic laws or Islamic Sharia had been enforced in one way or the other right from the beginning 1947, so we would not have faced this problem of fundamentalism in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iran, and in other Muslim countries. But because the Western powers, they advocated and they supported the secular elements which had grabbed the states, so now it is the fundamentalists, those who say that why not we, who are the real possessors or inheritors of religion Islam, so why should we not seize the state, power of the state, and then implement Islam? And I think even now the Western powers, they have not understood this core issue. That's why these problems are being created. And another issue, as you mentioned, I have always been skeptic about the role of the U.S. in solving these religious or social conflicts, rather than the U.S. government, various its agencies, CIA and others, they have always been trying to compound these problems to rather than mitigating them and rather than resolving them. Again, take the examples of Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Now in Pakistan there is a public perception that the United States is behind all these conflicts, the Swat operation, Waziristan, even US money is flowing, US arms are flowing into Pakistan. So some people, they accuse the Taliban, but there is a major section of the population which accuses even the United States, whose partner we are in war against terror.
Sir,
so these two,
do you have a question?
these
Yeah.
two.
There's other questions.
Oh.
Do you have a question? No, go ahead. Do you have a question? Or?
No, I just, it was a comment as well as a question that do you agree that the United States has not been, very sincere in conflict resolution of these issues in the Muslim world?
Well, depending on what we mean by United States, I would agree with you. Certainly in the case of Afghanistan, the politicization and the instrumentalization of the movement is, for political and geostrategic purposes was obvious. And I don't disagree with your assertion that in many respects the kind of modern-day Islamist project, which is focusing on the power of the state, has something to do with the ways in which actors in the state, in alignment with foreign powers, colonialist powers, try to sort of divest the state of certain cultural, religious traditions and institutions for their own political purposes. There's no doubt about it. But those are the roots of a conflict and a set of realities that in the ensuing 100+ years became much more complex. And if you visit Morocco, you has no doubt that the split between Islamists and, in this case I would say secularists, has something to do with French colonialism. Who would deny that for a moment? But who would also deny that the fact that Morocco is a place that is profoundly divided culturally? The debate in Algeria between those who believe that the society should be speaking French or English or Arabic is profound. And that even after the post-colonial period, of course, states went on to manipulate and instrumentalize these sort of fears for their own purposes. So I think the reality is very complex, but I think you've just described an important part of a very complex reality. And the U.S. has this contradictory of task, this legacy of, in some sense, being involved in manipulating these sorts of conflicts, at the same time paying a high cost itself. Let's recognize 9/11 and the kind of cost we have paid for the boomerang effect of this legacy for our own society. At the same time, I think we have all kinds of institutions. USIP is just one of them, staffed by good people who recognize that And I think, I'm hoping that President Obama's June 4th speech in Cairo is indicative of kind of a different approach, whereby we would like to promote an honest effort to sort of bring these various conflicting legacies together, as opposed to simply exacerbate the problems for our own purposes. So I think that is a great challenge, but there's a contradictory element in it that's clearly reflected in the book we're talking about today, and I would certainly agree with you.
Thank you. I just want to take this gentleman's statement, which I thought was very nice, and ask a question based on it. Given historically that there's been a separation of church and state, some colonial influences on that, if we can progress history forward, repair the damage, what would the reintegrated state look like if it was both a religious and a democratic state that would also take into account progressive things like the rights of women, rights of religious minorities, etc. What if you could draw in the air? And I'll ask you to put on your wizard's hat and the crystal ball, because we talk in abstract, but I would just like to know what that might look like.
You know, that's a rich and almost unfair question, and I don't mean to be rude, and this may sound somewhat contradictory, but there was a really good piece in the Washington Post about 4 weeks ago about the American effort to promote a kind of modern Islam in Indonesia. And many of the people quoted in that article are friends of mine. They were part of the Islamic, liberal Islamic network, and they were really doing battle with various elements of the sort of Islamist community, including their parents, I mean, who viewed these young upstarts as dangerous. And the effect of the American sort of effort to back them, in many respects, undermined their own sort of integrity. And much of the efforts they were pursuing in the late 90s and after that, they've closed down as a result of that, because it's very difficult. What I'm trying to say is that while the United States has a role to play, I think that ultimately the place where the answers to your questions have to be addressed are...
I'm not saying that even with our role, I'm asking us to play the...
Right. Well, I'm hesitant.
What would it look like if
Yeah, but I'm hesitant as an American to say what it would look like. I'm trying to say that because I think this is something that there has to be a recognition that these are indigenous solutions, that people have to thrash them out as best they can, that perhaps we can help to create a context where that can be done through negotiation, not through violence, right? So not the Lebanese civil war is obviously not the way to resolve the Lebanon conflict, for example. But in the generalist sense, it seems to me that the solution would you couldn't talk about a kind of purely secular model, whatever that means. I think you could talk about a model in which there is a compartmentalized role for religious leaders that provide them some sort of place in the overall formula of political life, but not one in which that would allow the state to ultimately dictate religious practices of citizens. And therefore, and I'll give you a concrete example of where this may or may not be reflected. Last year, the Muslim Brethren in Egypt set out a series of proposals suggesting a council of clerics which would provide input, their opinions on the legislation of the parliament. This created a huge controversy. From the point of view of the secularists, this was seen as the Iranian model, a new council of guardians. Now, the Muslim Brethren insisted that's not what they had in mind, that they wanted to create a form whereby sort of the clerics would have some sort of moral input. But, how do what's the boundary between sort of guidance? This issue has come up, I mean, I know the Iranian case very well. I've written about it extensively. The Council of Guardians was not, the notion of the Council of Guardians was a council that was going to provide input, and over time it became much more interventionist and went way beyond the boundaries that many even good Islamic revolutionaries envisioned in the early days of the revolution. So I recognize that there may be some need to think about sort of ways and creative ways of integrating religious leaders and thinkers, but I don't know how you sort of maintain the boundaries so the integrity of the state as a protector of religious freedom is protected. And I do know that that's something that has to be addressed. And authoritarian regimes are very good at not creating the space by which for addressing these issues. They don't really want these issues resolved. They would like them just to fester.
And if I must, I would like to say, if you push, sometimes when you're in a situation where there is no voice of these religious communities, that potentially you push to the periphery, and then you have what has resulted, which is people feeling not a part of the society, the governing society, and so you have a backlash because it can generate this.
That is true. Of course, you have in many cases in the Middle East, you have many of the religious figures have been co-opted by the state. And so, I mean, we often talk about Ataturk as an example of, no, I know you're not, but the question is, where do you create the space? The state would like to sort of comprehend and embrace all these religious leaders. Ataturk is an example of secularism. Well, the secular state in Turkey hired and paid for the ulama and created an institution was an appendage of the state. Is that secularism? So where do you, you're right, isolating people only tends to promote extremism. There has, but I have to say this, that I think I say this as much in one of my contributions to this book. I think that in the Sunni world, politically active Islamists are still sort of wrestling with the notion of, well, if we're advancing the notion of freedom, at the same time we think the state should be an enforcer of Islamist doctrines, so how do we reconcile these sorts of two agendas? And I don't see this, and who's to be the enforcer of the doctrine? I mean, Islamists in the Arab world tend to be lay intellectuals. They're not part of the clerical establishment for the most part. And they've always accused the clerical establishment of essentially foregoing their role as protectors of Islam. Yet, precisely because there is no formal clerical establishment in Sunni Islam, exactly who's supposed to be the enforcer of the ultimate truth of Islam? That's the answer for that you don't get. And so again, this has to do with this notion of creating a kind of social civil Islam, in which the state is not going to be the ultimate, particularly in the context of a religious tradition, which in fact the clerics are not supposed to be owned by the state, even though in so many cases they really are.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Bowles.
I'm sorry, Cynthia, wait just a second.
Okay. I'm an attorney in conflict resolution and at Tom Reed's in the Berkeley Center, where I saw you last.
That's right. Okay, I thought I recognized you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious, when you talk about card-based corruption, I think we need to address that in the context of who's corrupting, right? And so I'm wondering if a lot of the contradictions in U.S. policy you're noticing, not something to do with our business interests that are affecting and influencing what we're trying to do politically. Like when we learn, for example, non-self aborted from the Taliban, going to Kuwait and Afghanistan, that whole scenario, cynical as it sounds, about going in and just trying to pave the way through the pipeline and marshalling the areas that are on the grounds that follow it. To what extent if we have new administration, we shift in priorities, we shift in the influence that this community has in those regions. If we take our resource investment interests out of the equation and we look at how we're going to develop in this country alternate energy, alternate sustainable green technology, etc. So we don't have a resource investment motivation there. What would that do to the equation? If we take out our corruption influences on Karzai, who we installed because he was the consultant on the pipeline, right? What does that do to peace in the region? I mean, if we completely excise our resource-based security interests?
Well, I mean, I guess I don't feel competent enough in the technicalities of this issue to give you a kind of an answer that I'm really confident of. My own sense, and this is more of a superficial sense, particularly when I think about the experience in Iraq, is that given sort of the huge challenges involved in these countries, that the kinds of contradictions of interest and so on that we're talking about are not going to be easily set aside or diminished without also diminishing a lot of the resources necessary to address the problem. So the question that I would ask is, how do we create real instruments of accountability? The corruption issue is huge in Iraq. and involves involves our own business firms with their own links to our government. I mean, recall 2005, 2006, 2007, and this is a continuing problem. So I would, I think we have to have much more stringent supervision. We have to take the issue of accountability seriously ourselves, and not just preach it abroad. At the same time, given the flows of money into these societies, I have a friend who's from Georgetown University who's now provost at the American University in Mobile, and he reflects in the 2 years he's been there. He's overwhelmed by what he sees as these inflows of cash and the opportunities for corruption, and how do you see he doesn't even know how you contend with it, and it doesn't involve these kinds of conflicts of interest so much as just the lack of an infrastructure to absorb these funds and hold people accountable, and so it's a tremendously difficult problem. But I recognize that you have to practice what you preach, and we have had a credibility problem, an accountability problem on this side of the ledger. Particularly, stories are, of course, legendary. The things of Iraq. I followed that story more closely than the Afghan story. But the kinds of problems of corruption in Afghanistan also have to do with the local police and the way they use their own powers. And I mean, you read stories from everyday life in Afghanistan, and the population sees these local police as predatory. It's existing. Well, I mean, we come in there and money flows into creating a new police force, but nevertheless, there's no sort of, these police are way off, far away, and feel no sense of any constraint on their behavior. So it's a complicated problem, but I think I recognize the kinds of contradictions you're talking
about. My name is Ashfaq Lodi, and I'm with American Muslim Alliance Foundation. This question may not be directly related to the book, but on conflict resolution, one of the strategies that some of the organizations here they have used is coalition building. Is there something in the pipeline that the U.S. government might consider about looking at coalition building in terms of not just the government and so on, but more so on issue basis? For example, hunger, poverty, and other allegations. So do you think in those lines we can build confidence in these part of the world, the Muslim world in particular, where we can help build the confidence and build an image of the U.S. in a positive sense?
Well, I wish empirically I would be familiar with the whole sort of menu of organizations that do the kinds of work you and I have been thinking about, but I've got to guess from some of the few I know that your idea has been adopted in many places. In other words, instead of trying to focus on explicitly the sectarian conflict, one talks about issues of welfare, social justice, of women's rights, and you try to provide a common set of activities which bring people together around those issues. And from the little I've seen in the field, that can be reasonably successful. But where the sectarian conflicts are overwhelming, or the religious conflicts, it's often jumping the gun because you just can't sort of ignore these realities. They come bubbling up anyway. So I think that you have to sort of do both. But there is a kind of room for, and I'm sure that if you look closely at the funding of this sort of program, there is, and of course in the case of the United States, it's easier to do because when they're talking about interreligious differences and so on, they don't have quite the political implications they do in a weaker state, obviously. So, but there's certainly room for this, and perhaps more should be done. If you look at programs that provide low-interest loans to women, look at the organization Women for Women, for example, which is an extraordinary organization. They try to sort of bridge the ideological religious divide by talking about programs that support women. But women who, if you're talking about Kosovo, the Balkans, may be coming from different religious backgrounds, but have a common interest, one of which is to deal with the patriarchal political structure to begin with. So, there are ways to do this.
My name is Missy Golson. I'm with the Stetson Center, and my question is more towards the term of using the Muslim world, because when I think of this term, I think, oh, it's just one entity, the Muslim world, and I know that a lot of Western diplomats and even President Obama has used the term, and so I would like to know your opinion on it, and do you think it's detrimental to to even use the term Muslim world when to talk about an entire religion of Islam and the different countries that consist of the Muslim world?
Yeah, I think it's detrimental in many ways. It's a lousy term. When I took over the Muslim World Initiative at USIP, we had a debate for a month about a different title. And nobody could come up with something that was better than this awful title. So I think you have to sort of recognize that unless you define what you mean and give it meat, you've got a problem. I prefer the term that President Obama uses, Muslim majority societies or states. I do recognize, boy, having spent time traveling in the so-called Muslim world, the diversity of societies and ways in which religion is articulated in the public sphere, and the danger of thinking about a Muslim world, which of course is what Islam, particularly radical Islamists, wanted to say, that there it is. And they know what, and they see it, they defend it, right? And the pluralism of that world is not recognized. So the term Muslim world is not a very good term, but we need, and many terms in our world are bad. We just have to sort of struggle with their limitations and recognize the things that you're getting at, which is that if used in a kind of simplistic, one-dimensional way, we're really doing an injustice to that world. And saying that, I'm not meaning to sort of ignore the common sort of sense of being part of a broader ummah and civilization and so on. Other religions, Christian and Jewish, have also wrestled with, is there a Jewish world? So we have a program at Georgetown called Jewish Civilization, which is actually, in terms of civilizations, has some others, and recognizes, to some extent, the commonality and at the same time the huge diversity of these communities. And the term has been used in reference to Islam, Muslim civilization as well. Hodgson, the great scholar from the University of Chicago, whose books we all read when I was a grad student, sort of used that term to encapsulate this complexity. But particularly when you're coming down to the policy world, where people, in this town have no time to read, and everything's an executive summary, you're forced to sort of come up with terms that get people's attention. And once you do that, then your job is to fill them.
Yeah, so, thank you. I'd actually like to go back to Kim's question about what would have been without the colonialist experience. And I think actually it's not that crazy or impossible to construct an artificial or simulated counterfactual. And I think one could do so by extrapolating from the period at the end of the Ottoman Empire, which was approximating a constitutional monarchy with the parliament, where all the minorities were represented, and the intervention of the head of the state into the life of the society was minimal. So if we take that experience and fast forward it 100 years ago, we might have a better idea of what a Muslim majority society with a semblance of separation between church and state would have been.
Well, I agree with that, and maybe you can make a compelling argument to say that this is what would have been had X, Y, and Z not occurred. But I'm far from convinced what the implications of that analysis, of that kind of counterfactual analysis, is for policy, or for actually addressing real-world set of challenges. And this ties into this issue of the Muslim world, because one of the things I've learned from my own comparative studies, this is a contradiction for somebody who's a comparativist, is the uniqueness of these various historical experiments. And so if you go to Morocco and talk to the Moroccan PJD about their experiences in Turkey, trying to take the Turkish model, or the Ak Party model, and transpose it to Morocco, and the conclusion is you can't. because Turkey is Turkey, and Morocco is Morocco, and Indonesia, and even if you do the Indonesian-Malaysian comparison, Southeast Asia, they're remarkably different places. So I think that ultimately it's many of the kinds of solutions we're talking about and policies that grow out of them really are going to reflect very local realities. And that's the challenge, to sort of recognize that level of complexity. We'll do part two of
I've been told, I'm sorry, but certainly after we're done speaking, ask your question. So thank you for joining us today at the Rumi Forum Washington, and please help me